War camels. Camels have been used in war since the earliest times of the Bronze Age to the modern age, in areas as vast as the Middle East, Central Asia, Africa, and also at times in southern Europe. Mainly two types of camels have been used historically. The Camelus dromedarius, the dromedary camel, mostly used in the Middle East and Africa, the one having one hump, and the Camelus bactrianus, the Bactrian camel with two humps, used mainly in Central Asia, though Khorasan hybrids between these two camels have existed too. You also have the New World camels, such as the llamas, that have been used as pack animals in war, but I will disregard these New World camels for this video. One of the earliest known recorded examples depicting camels used in war is an Assyrian stone tablet of Arabian camel riders trying to beat back the Assyrian invasion of the Arabic Peninsula in the 9th century. Though even earlier examples of mentioning camels exist in various clay and stone tablets, mentioning camels used in war back in the earliest times of Akkad and Sumer in Mesopotamia, more than 4,000 years ago. And in modern times, you have had camels used as pack animals in war, in for example the World Wars. And camels have been used in war by many peoples, by various African peoples, by Persians, by Romans, by the Arabs, and by various Central Asian nomadic peoples, and even used in southern Europe, in Italy, by the Italian city-states, and in Spain during the medieval and Renaissance periods. Camels have primarily been used in 4 roles that were often overlapping at times. First is assault camels. These were usually armored camels that were used as shock cavalry. Then you had ranged camel units, which were camels mounted by archers or gunners, even using small-scale gunpowder artillery that would stay at range and shoot on the enemy from a distance. Javelins too were used a lot, as a camel, due to its big size, could carry a lot of javelins too, so that was an alternative that was also used for ranged combat involving camels. Then you had camels used as troop transports, to transport foot archers and foot soldiers to various places in order for them to easier carry out assaults on foot. And speaking about carrying things, camels have been used since the earliest times of war as pack animals to carry provisions, weapons, and various things that are needed on a military campaign. Using camels have both historically had positives and negatives in comparison to, for example, horses. Firstly, camels are larger animals than horses. Bactrian camels weigh around 500 to 1000 kilos, which is 1100 to 2200 pounds, and dromedary camels weigh about 400 to 700 kilos, which is about 880 pounds to 1540 pounds. And in comparison, horses for war weigh about 300 to 500 kilograms, which is 660 to 1100 pounds. Camels being this much larger means that they could also carry more and heavier armor than horses could carry, and thus be more protected animals that were harder to kill than a horse. Though you did need to have special armor for camels, but that was also true for horses, as they also carried specially modified horse armor. But in any case, camel armor could be heavier made than horse armor, and thus offer greater protection to the camel than the horse armor could for the horse, due to the fact that the camel could carry heavier armor. Now, camels are generally slower than horses, but when charging into an enemy line, the additional weight of a camel and its armor is a multiplier that removes the issue of the slower speed, as the impact is about the same. Also, camels, being such strong animals, can also carry several armored men, a lot more than a horse can carry, and thus act as a transport in a way that a singular horse cannot, by dropping off people that would later assault on foot after the camels had charged in and disrupted the formations of the enemy. Furthermore, it should also be known that both camels that were used, the Bactrian camels and the dromedary camels, stand about 1.8 meters at the shoulders and 2.2 meters at the hump, between 6 to 7 feet. In comparison, 1.5 meter to 1.6 meters, about 5 feet, is the normal for most warhorse breeds. Exceptions to these tend to actually be smaller nomadic warhorses from Central Asia that are even smaller when it comes to the shoulder height. This means that the rider of the camel is sitting higher up on a camel than on a horse, which gives the rider a better view and an easier time to strike down without getting struck himself. This is especially important in a cavalry battle against horse-mounted cavalry, where it is easier for the camel-mounted soldier to strike the body with a spear or the head of the other rider with a sword or club than it is for the other way around for the horse-mounted rider to strike the camel rider. Also, camels offer a very firm and stable platform to steady your aim and to strike from, be it with a spear or a bow. And on the subject of camel battles and cavalry battles, camels actually scare horses that are not used to camels, as they are very big and scary animals for the horses. And thus camels can be used as a sort of terror animal to frighten horses in a cavalry battle when the other army's horses are not used to camels. But speaking about terror and fright, this goes into one of the negatives of camels, and that is camel PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. As camels actually suffer from this, in a way this happens also with horses too, but it is less common with war horses than with camels. And war camels were known to break down and not be able to fight anymore, and to just flee or freeze in battle, or when close to battles, or never ever getting close to battles again, because they were traumatized during a battle. And this is due to the fact that camels are smart animals that will usually not charge into pike and spear formations, or even into even less dangerous formations of troops. Especially if they have learned about the dangers of doing these actions after having done it and getting traumatized from it. Furthermore, even getting a camel trained to the point that they do it once is hard to do. It is actually harder to train camels for war than it is to train horses for war, as camels require a personal relationship to the rider, kind of like how elephants require it in order to function as war animals, and thus specified trainers and riders that spend constant time with the animal is required, not like a war horse where a third party can train it and it is then used by another warrior. Here you have to have a personal relationship to the animal in a way that is not the case for war horses. And this means that it requires more money, because you have to have the rider being the trainer as well of the animal, and it also requires much more time to train a camel for war than a horse. And also, certain camels will never really work as war animals, as they will refuse to actually do the training or refuse to do anything that is close to a battle scenario. This is true for certain horses too, but it is true to a larger extent with camels, and thus you have a larger amount of loss of animals that never really worked as war animals to be used in battle. And thus this means that camels were a lot more costly as war animals than horses. The potential loss of animals that never really worked as war animals among camels, and the need for personal training of camels, meant that large and actually complicated logistics to train war camels on a large scale were needed if you wanted to field large-scale camel armies, as these things would involve a lot of people being involved one trainer for every camel that would also be armed and trained in the arts of war, as the trainer would be the same as the rider. In addition, you would need to feed the camels, and you would need to actually get new animals when certain animals got sick and died or didn't work as war animals. Or the trainers got sick and died, and thus the animal no longer became a viable war animal anymore, as the personal relationship to the animal did not really exist anymore. And this is also why the majority of Arabic armies have mainly used horses for cavalry, and camels were a part of the armies, but usually the minority of cavalry. Because there were such enormously complicated chains of logistics to train the animals, to ensure that there existed enough animals to create viable military units. And speaking about logistics, camels actually need about the same or even more food than horses need. They are a bigger animal after all, so that makes sense when you think about it. But camels can go hungry for longer periods of time than horses, but their total intake of food is actually greater than horses. They are just able to eat, digest and spare more energy in their humps for later, whereas horses actually need constantly to have food and thus cannot mass eat for shorter periods like camels can. Logistically, this both complicates and makes it easier to use camels. It makes it easier to use camels for shorter campaigns of about a couple of months. It means that you do not have to feed the camels that much until you return. But on longer campaigns, you need to bring a larger amount of food than you would for horses, in the form of hay or have pastures close to your army. Otherwise, the camels will starve. And this makes camels different in their logistical aspects than horses. I compare a lot to horses in this video because horses are the other alternative of this type of cavalry that camels represent, that you could use instead of camels, or that you could use camels instead of horses for. And you might also wonder why camels were not that widely used in Northern Europe, for example, if camels are a legitimate substitute for horses in certain cases. Well, firstly, you had the cost of camels, as mentioned before, that they required a lot of heavy logistics to use, which for most of European history was not possible. The Middle East, generally, where mass cavalry of camels have been used, has been a place of greater wealth and greater ability to support these types of logistics required to utilize camels on a large scale. And thus, you see camels there. But there is one other reason. It does not have to do with the cold weather, as camels can actually survive the cold weather of Northern Europe just fine. It has to do with other reasons. The primary reason being that camels require hard, flat, open ground without many bushes or trees in the way, in order to operate effectively. In this, camels are even more hampered than horses when having to move through thickets of thick forest and bushes, which there are a lot of in Northern and Central Europe, than is the case with horses, as they are bigger animals that easier get stuck in thickets and forests, and they have less developed legs and feet for walking through forests. Furthermore, camel feet are a lot more susceptible to injuries and infections than the hooves of horses. Thus, camels moving upon unsuitable terrain risk a lot more injuries than horses, and a lot more camels are going to die from various injuries and infections when camels are utilized on a larger scale on terrain that camels are not suitable for, which coincidentally includes most of Central and Northern Europe. Again, it isn't the temperature or the weather, because if you look at, for example, Central Asia and the Central Asian steppes, where camels were utilized, on those steppes, it can at times get much colder than in Central or Northern Europe. But the terrain there is usually very smooth, open and flat, making it possible for camels to move there without risking injury and thus be utilized easier as animals of war. And this does not even go into the matter of making it easier to utilize camels in a domestic civilian context in these areas with flatter terrain. Because you need a civilian camel usage base in order to create the breeding programs and have the availability of camels for war later. And Central and Northern Europe is not ideal due to the terrain for using camels in a civilian context as pack animals or for other purposes, and thus it reflects also in the lack of using camels for a military context also, since the civilian base for camel husbandry never developed to any great extent in Central and Northern Europe, and you need a civilian base for a large-scale military camel usage. And this is an example of how geography and terrain can determine which animals are utilized for warfare. And also, this is the end of this video about camel use in warfare. And I hope you enjoyed it and found it interesting. Please post comments and questions. I love interacting with you, my viewers.
Please do subscribe, as it would help the channel spread awareness about the humanities.
اشتركوا بالقناة المفضلة.